Heavenly Father, thank you for your faithfulness through all of these years.
There's nothing better than to be used by God. We had a desire to buy some property that had a large living room because we wanted to have a small Bible study in our house. We just really wanted to be used by the Lord and help to promote the gospel. I became a real estate agent so that I would have access to property, and the house and trail came on the market. The house was everything that, what it said was what we wanted. It was on 5 acres and had a little barn and a house and a large living room. So when I talked to Steve about it, he said, we don't want to live that far away from our fellowship church. As soon as I drove him in the driveway, he changed. It was like, he says, you're right. I understand what you're saying. I think this is where God wants us to be.
1979, how old are you?
26, just turned 26.
And you're on staff at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.
I am.
And the Lord is prompting you to consider planting a church?
Absolutely. In those days, that was the theme at Costa Mesa, was to plant churches, which is a very great thing. The idea was learn how the church works, how it functions, and then go plant the gospel someplace that needs a church.
We put money down on the house with lots of prayer. We were able to move into the house at 819 Ragsdale Road in Trail.
I was talking with John Corson from Applegate, because he and I go back many, many years. We were roommates in college. So on both worked for Chuck Smith. And I was just telling him I'm thinking of going up to Sandpoint, Idaho, starting a church. And he said, well, before you do that, you should come to Trail, Oregon. Guy Gray, who was at the time the pastor of Medford Christian Fellowship, which became eventually Cornerstone Church, and still there. Guy was doing a Bible study out in Trail at the home of Sylvia and Steve McHouston. I had to find 2 maps before I found anything with Trail on it. And I thought, oh my goodness, you kidding me? And John said, come and talk to these people. So I came up and visited with John, then went and visited with this group in Trail, and I did a Bible study in the evening. It was November of 1979. And I remember it was a rainy, dark evening, and couldn't find the house, but somebody met me in a big old truck with a big dog sticking his head out the back window of the truck. We rolled down our windows and he said, follow me. So I went up, John and I both, and did a Bible study for that little group, had a good experience with them, and then went back to Costa Mesa, talked with some more people on the phone and so on, and felt like that was probably where we should go. So we put in notice at Costa Mesa at the end of 1979.
I remember going to Steve and Sylvia's because that was where the church was at. It was their house up in Trail. They had horses. I remember we had to, because they didn't have a sidewalk at the time, we had to walk across some plywood, and it was really muddy. And so we were like walking across, and very carefully, so we didn't want to get muddy because we're girls. And they had 2 boxer dogs that would they were so excited to see us, so we were like trying not to get muddy, but the dogs are muddy. And so I remember getting to the door after that. I don't remember much. I just remember that long trek on the plywood.
Like 10 feet.
I'm sure it was, but when you're little, everything feels really big.
I have very few memories of really young. Like, I don't remember the McHouston's house. I don't remember much of that.
We started kind of like officially in 1980. The first actual Sunday service that we had I think only about 10 people came. The living room was not packed.
We discovered after we got here that there had been something of a cult group who had given Calvary Chapel a bad name. They weren't really from Calvary.
Okay.
And so there was a smaller group when we got here who actually really wanted to be starting the church. And then gradually some of the people who had been a part of that other group filtered back in. But we had probably 10 or 11, maybe 12 people in our Sunday morning meeting in the living room. And a couple of really nice boxer dogs who lay there on the and so we would sing a cappella a few songs, and then pray together, and I would do a Bible study. But that's all we wanted to do, and that's what we did.
And how long were you guys at Steve and Sylvia's house?
I'm guessing it was not more than 2 or 3 months, and some other young couples, some of whom had been involved in that previous group, who were genuine believers, and they started to filter in, and so we thought, well, we need a little more room.
So what were you guys doing in the summer of 1980?
We met outdoors, out in front of Elk Trail School, which was this very picturesque, I mean, it was just absolutely beautiful. And we prayed there would be no bad weather all summer long, and there was no bad weather all summer long. And so we met there on the Sundays, and then I would ask people if you'd like to come to the Lord, and we would baptize people at Elk Creek, which was just down the road from Elk Trail School. We baptized several in that first summer, and some of those people who were baptized at that time are still very good friends of ours, still plugged in at Trail Fellowship to this day.
So the summer shifts to the fall. What happens then?
Well, the weather was coming on,
Yep.
so I checked with Dan Ginther, the principal overseeing these schools, and he said, yeah, you can use the gym at Elk Trail School for the next several months. And by this time, there was a significant number of people coming, probably 50 to 100 folks. Once again, we're talking about all young, basically hippies,
right,
to a great extent. And then we moved after that down to Shady Cove itself, and we used the Shady Cove multi-purpose room,
okay,
which was a room built adjacent to the school, and they would use it partly for the school. I think it was a school kind of a building, but they used it for different events in the community, and we rented that on Sunday mornings. And then we had outgrown it, kind of. We needed room for our kids, and we rented a tiny little office, which is in a building that's no longer in Shady Cove. But it was an office right next to a restaurant called The Shack back in the day. And I remodeled that little office myself, and we used that as a children's area. And then right down the road at the school, we would meet in the gym after we met in the multi-purpose room, and another building that is I think no longer in place in between the two that we also met in. So we met in 3 different locations for our adults over the next 2 years, because we kept outgrowing the places we were.
So this brings us up to about 82, 83. And at this point, how many people are attending TCF?
83, 84 probably,
okay,
actually.
Okay.
We would set up chairs. We had all the chairs in a trailer, and we'd back them up, and the deacons would just unload the chairs, set it all up in the gym at Shady Cove School. At that time, we were setting up probably a couple hundred chairs on a Sunday morning.
Every Sunday morning. And just people just helping out every Sunday, pitching
Oh yeah,
in.
everybody was pitching in. You know, they knew that when they were coming that this was, you know, a startup thing.
Steve and I were involved. He did most of the sound, and we recorded on cassette tapes. I should have brought one of those with me. Nobody knows what a cassette tape is anymore. And I basically just kind of did the background work and keeping track of the money and paying the bills. And Steve and I did that all voluntarily for many, many years.
By that time, more volunteers in worship and praise, and you know, we were singing choruses, which at the time contemporary Christian music had not quite penetrated Southern Oregon. And so we and Applegate and Ashland Fellowship and Cornerstone, Medford Christian Fellowship was called in those days, were the only churches in the area doing contemporary worship. And all it meant was we were using guitars and singing choruses.
Okay.
That basically was what we were doing. And we had a couple hundred people on a Sunday morning.
At that point, you're completely satisfied with the work that God's doing here.
I was actually stunned.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a community where the population of the city is 2,000 or 2,500.
Right.
And we have people coming to church on a Sunday morning that represent 10% of that population. I mean, that's
stunning. Yeah, that's
yeah.
stunning.
I was surprised. It was more than I expected.
So you have a growing young church. Many people are coming to the Lord. Where are you baptizing people in those days?
We were in Shady Cove by this time, even though we retained the name Trail Christian, because that's where we started, was in the community of Trail. But we began to do baptisms at the boat ramp at the Shady Cove Park, in the Rogue River. Yeah.
One of my strongest memories is being baptized at the Shady Cove Park in the river. I was 8 years old when I was baptized, I think, if I remember correctly.
What are you saying when you get baptized? You're saying four things. First, you're saying Jesus Christ is the risen and saving Lord. But that's not all. You're also saying I've repented and declared loyalty to Him. Third, you're saying I'm trusting Him alone for my forgiveness and eternal life. I'm trusting Him alone, Him alone, Him alone. I'm not adding to it. I'm not doing anything extra to make it work. I'm simply trusting Him. And what you're saying when you get baptized is I'm trusting Jesus, not myself. You're also saying, number four, I'm a disciple now and forever. It was cold.
And nobody died of hypothermia?
I almost did, but nobody that was baptized, actually.
Okay, well, that's all that matters.
Yeah, I was in the water for a while. It got cold.
Where were you guys meeting at this point?
We were meeting in the Shady Cove gym at the time, and then on a Monday following a Sunday, one of their heating units, it was an old building, and one of their heating units caught fire, and it burned to the ground. And I remember because I think it was Dan, I think it was the principal there, called me and said, that must have been some sermon because it burned the building down, right? So we're laughing about this. Well, then we didn't know where to go, and what happened was they had just built, it was a new building, the community center, the Shady Cove Community Center, which was just right across the road from the gym. Right. So we called them and asked if we could use that for a while, and they said yes. Everyone was very gracious to us. The community was very gracious to us. And so we used that, we rented it for a while, but that was the point at which we realized that we needed to fish or cut bait with regard to getting a building ourselves, because we had run out of places to rent in the community. Right. Yeah. And we had gotten a line on a piece of property, which is the campus we currently own. And so we purchased the property and began to pray for a way to not just pay for the property, but build a building on it.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was what year?
That would have been 84, 85.
Okay.
At the end of 83, in through 84, and then the building projects, I think, was happening in 84 and into 85.
What were some things as you look back, especially during that 84 when you're thinking about purchasing the property, that you clearly see the Lord's hand of faithfulness?
Well, every day. First of all, I would say honestly that He gathered together around us, even though we were young. Everybody was young, right? Chronologically, but some very excellent, solid, young believers. That was a gift. Our first elders. Because when you incorporate, you have to choose a board, right? And you choose from who you have. You know, we never had an outside board. It was always from within. And I consider it a gift that the first 6 or 7 guys that I tapped and asked them if they would join the board were wonderful, solid Christian men who remained with us for quite a while. And I consider that to be really an amazing thing. Right. And that was before we even had the office really squared away. So we would have board meetings in my van because it was set up so that you could sit on the inside, had a little couch and everything.
Was this van down by the river?
Yeah, we would drive it down into the park, and we would have our board meetings in there. It was it was a hippie van, and it was set up with a little place to sit. So that's where we had our board meetings. And I would say that that was a major gift. The other major wonderful things that happened was when we needed to build, it looked utterly impossible. The interest rates in the early 80s were around 15 to 16% to borrow money. And we had no money, and we thought to ourselves, well, if we were a family going to buy a house, what could we afford with our current income, which wasn't much.
Right.
But miraculously, two people from outside the area, I won't give the names, when I called them and said, this is our situation, would you be willing to take a risk on us and loan us enough money to build a building? They said, yes, we will. And they loaned us the money slightly under the going rate at the time. So they weren't making as much off of their money as they could have. Right. I consider that also to be a seriously miraculous provision at the time. And then we were able to pay them both back within 5 years. So it was an amazing thing to see the Lord come through. And then we built the building in '85, the first building, which is currently our youth wing. It was our sanctuary at the time. So I'd say those were big moments in my personal life as a pastor. I remember praying in the office after we built the building, and we still had bills to pay, and there was some stress about it. And I was just saying, Lord, you got to show us what to do. And then as it was needed, you know, the provision was there. A lot of folks in our church were out of work in the 80s. So it was a big step of faith to say we need to build this building, and we're praying for the money to come in. And one of the sweetest things was
a little widow lady came in. She lived in Butte Falls, and her name was Glenna Roden.
She said, I have something for the building fund. And it was a small box, and inside of it, it was filled with silver bars that had been kept under her mattress. It was part of her savings and part of her nest egg, and she brought that to us. I think the total amount was a couple $100, but what mattered to me was this just amazing, generous gift. She had not hardly any money at all, and here she brought these silver bars that she had been saving.
I remember that so well because it was like the widow's mite.
Were there seasons in that time that you were discouraged, disappointed?
Oh yeah.
Frustration?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I almost quit in the first 3 years before we built the building. I almost quit a couple different times because we were dying on the vine financially. And we were there a year before we had $100 in the offering.
Oh boy.
And we had exhausted our savings.
You got to feed your family.
Yeah. We had completely exhausted our savings, and I had gone to work part-time for my brother-in-law, helping him build houses. He was a contractor in the area.
Okay.
And I was swinging a hammer, and because I was raised, my dad was a builder, and I knew a little bit about it, so I was a laborer, basically.
Right.
And the Lord spoke to me and said, no, there's people getting saved here. I want you to keep them. We could see the spiritual fruit, but we were not able to make ends meet. And that was a difficult time. That was back in 82, 83, and it was frustrating. I remember I said, Lord, if you want me to move, I'll move. If you want me to go somewhere else, but I gotta. So I had my suitcases there where I could find them. And I would sign up for 1 year at a time. I said, Lord, I'll stay another year. If there's fruit and people are getting saved and we're seeing good, solid fruit, I'll stay another year. Because I really didn't know. Right. In those days, in the early on, 80, 81, 82, 83, I wasn't really sure, but then we did see fruit. So then I said, okay, I'll sign on for another 5 years. That's the way I did it. Well, the Lord's plan was for me to stay longer, but those were more difficult than a lot of people realize. You know, there are very good memories from back then, but there were also some difficult moments.
I began attending Trail probably when I was about 2 or 3 years old. Some of my memories of the places that we met at to begin with before Trail had a kind of a facility of its own are just of the gathering of the people, running around as a small tyke with the other kids through the Grange, racing matchbox cars on the floor.
I remember that little office, and it was tiny. And I remember Gary and Nancy Cummings. I just remember Gary would pick us up by the arm and the leg and just swing us around like grown-ups do with the kids. And I remember doing that. I remember loving them. They were fun.
I remember Mahanim starting out at my folks' property the first couple times. We camped out next to the pond, I think out on the sand, on the court, volleyball court. And I remember as a young child, since I wasn't really the age of the kids that were going there, I always threw a fit because I had to go back up to the house. I didn't get to stay the night in the camp out, but I got to come join in for the hikes and the other activities.
Camp Mahoney, best ever. Loved that time frame. I have the best memories of it, partly because behind the scenes, Mommy and Vicky would be like tying all the pieces together, and there was so much like going on with preparation and stuff like that. So even before Camp Mahoney started, there was all this prep work prior to it, but then just the Mahanim song, sitting around the campfire, and then of course high school. I mean, high school was, I loved youth group. Gary and Val were the youth pastors, and oh my gosh, so many good memories going up to the Harrington house and playing in the ponds, and I don't know, just the overnighters that us girls would have. Probably the most impacting like high school teenage stuff, and all of, you know, I think we would all start watching a movie, and then the guys, I don't know what the guys did. They left, I didn't care. We hung out, maybe they went to somebody else's house. I don't know, but us girls, we got to stay there at the Harrington's house and stay up late in the night and have Bible study and talk about girls stuff. And of course, you know, just seeing how the Lord used all of that and totally impacted.
As a teenager, I remember the Hallelujah Hoedown was always a fun event that was very enjoyable to be a part of. I think as a teenager, I enjoyed helping out at the booths even more than I ever did as a younger child going to the events. Giving away goldfish to parents who did not want to get goldfish that Halloween. I remember helping out with worship and helping out with the kids' worship with my mom.
Being the fourth generation that's been going to Trail, it really just drives the point further that God is faithful, that He will be with us no matter what. It's His plan.
Being the fourth generation is kind of crazy to think about it, because it doesn't feel like it's been that long. Well, it hasn't really been that long, but then again it has. It shows me that, like he said, God is forever faithful, and He is constant, helping us proceed and progress.
To me, it's crazy how the church has developed and has prospered, and it's crazy. It's awesome.
Now, at what point did you bring Chris White on staff?
He was our first pastoral hire.
Okay.
And it was before we built the building. It was when we were still using the little office in Shady Cove, 82, 83, something in there. He oversaw kids ministry.
And how old was Chris?
Chris was in his early 20s.
Okay.
And his wife Christine, and they are still dear close friends.
Sure. Yeah.
She said that he was still outgrowing his jeans as a young guy. I think she was teasing a little about that. He and I worked together up until just 2 years ago, so 30 many years.
So now mid-1985, first building project is completed. What takes place for TCF after that?
Well, we used that building a lot. We used it for everything. We thought, well, if we seat 250 people in here, maybe 300, we don't need anything bigger than that for this community. This will be what we need. Well, we needed more. People kept getting saved, and we went to 2 services. We expanded our staff. My brother Dave came on our staff. Buff Lawrence came on our staff at that time. Later, Gary Harrington came on our staff and oversaw the youth ministries, and we adjusted the various staffing positions so that we could cover everything. We had a period of, it wasn't explosive growth, but it was a steady growth numerically through the 80s and into the 90s. And we also began to expand in terms of missions. One of the things that Pastor Chris did was begin a missions emphasis. It started small and developed through the years, and that was a very fruitful time.
Any other ministry initiatives at that point?
No, mostly we were trying to minister to our own community and draw people to Christ and equip them so that they could serve within the body of Christ. We were at that age as a church where we were just coming into having some folks who were of an older age, because we had real contemporary worship at the time.
Right.
And so they had to get used to that if they were coming in from the older traditions. And we were just making that shift in the 90s, where we had some older folks in, some more mature believers, and they were starting to help us. So the initiatives of ministry began to grow kind of naturally. Women's ministry, men's ministry, more youth ministry, and also the missions emphasis that Chris had brought on was starting to develop.
So we're into the 1990s now. TCF just continues to grow, and there's a sense within the elder board need to add a 3rd service.
Oh yeah. We went to 3 services so that we could just accommodate the growth, and we also expanded. We expanded the sanctuary a little bit, did a little bit of remodeling, and made a little bit more room so we could get close to 300 people in there, and yeah.
And with 3 services, the needs of ministry involvement from volunteers, it must just increase significantly.
It did, and that was always a stressor. It is, I think, in any young church. You're always in need of volunteers, qualified, reliable, solid people to minister to youth and to be involved around the edges. And that was a need for us, but the Lord always provided, and we were able to sustain.
It's also about, in the 90s, you start going back to school at Western Seminary.
I did. I had received a bachelor's degree in biblical studies from Biola before it was a university. It's Biola University now, but back when it was Biola College. And that was a good foundation for me in terms of knowledge and stability theologically. However, I began to feel kind of like I was running on empty. In the late 80s, I began to feel that way. And Guy Gray and I, and he was pastoring down in Medford, and we remained friends to this day. We're very good friends. We both felt the same way. So we got involved in a summer school project in Canada at Regent College. J.I. Packer had recently moved there and was teaching theology in the summers. Gordon Fee also, Michael Green, Eugene Peterson. These guys were teaching at Regent, and we said we want to go there and get involved in learning. Well, that whetted my appetite. I only audited those courses in those days, but it whetted my appetite, and I realized I needed more education. But I didn't want to go all the way to Canada, and I had a history with other reliable teachers who had gone to Western Seminary in Portland, and meanwhile, Guy Gray had moved to Portland, started River West Church up there, which is still a going church. And he said, hey, come and look at this program up here. So I did. I met Gary Brashears, got involved in the master's program there in exegetical theology. And so worked on it slowly through in the 90s and finally got my master's there. Yeah, and then after that, a few years later, I went back to the same school and got the doctorate in ministry from Western.
So the 90s, the church continues to grow, and you as a pastor are continuing to grow the whole time.
Yeah, the growth of the church forced my growth.
Right.
Seriously, I sensed in my heart I needed to stay growing myself mentally in order to sustain the training that needed to be done for the people in the body and for the other leaders and so on. So yeah, it forced my growth, and then my growth, I think, helped the growth of the church too.
So the early 2000s, when does the building project for the new campus, or the campus we're in now, when does that begin?
Well, in the 90s, we built what is known now as our fireside room, and it was one whole building, and we used the fireside room, those big restrooms, and the youth high school center, and we used that for quite a while. And then we had to make a decision because we had no place where we could all meet except outside in the summer, which we did in those years.
Yeah.
We met from anywhere from 10 to 14 weeks in the summertime at our outdoor area because it was the only place where the whole body could get together. So we sensed strongly that the Lord would want us to build something that we could all be in. Like we're a family, let's build something that we can all be in together year-round. And then that's what prompted starting the what we call the new sanctuary, which isn't new anymore, but the larger one that we have now. And that would have been, I think we finished that in 2007 or 2008. Right in there is where we finished that.
Pastor Buff was pretty much leading that charge.
Yes.
Tremendous, him and Ron.
Yep, they did a
Tremendous work.
huge.
Gary Shaw.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gary Shaw, bless his heart, good friend with the Lord now. But he was the main contractor for it, and Ken Snelling was the architect, and we're very, very pleased with how it all turned out.
Served us well for the last
absolutely
12 years or
absolutely.
So. Yeah. When you look back 40 years now, what are some of just highlights of the ministry at TCF?
Well, for me, it's not so much one particular highlight. It's a steady, growing appreciation for the power of the gospel in people's lives, and just seeing it. A living church always has ups and downs.
Right.
There's always crisis to deal with among people. We're just humans, and sinners saved by grace. To me, it wasn't like there was one explosive moment. It was more like a succession of faithful things that God did. So.
And looking forward to the future, what are your hopes for TCF going forward?
My hopes are that the next generation of leaders will continue with the vision for the power of the gospel, the transformation of people's lives. Our ministry motto, so to speak, our mission statement is helping people think like Jesus. And sometimes when I tell other pastors that, especially at the doctoral level, where you're talking to lead pastors and they're talking about mission statements, they say, well, don't you want to be more specific? And yes and no, because what you really want to do is you want to know what Jesus thinks about salvation, which is that you're saved by grace through faith, apart from works, by putting your faith in Him as the true Lord. What does Jesus say about mission? It's that you go and make disciples. So out of this idea of thinking like Jesus, all of the other realities of a living church should come. So my hope would be that the next generation of leaders, which we see, I think, on the scene right now, is going to continue with that vision and continue to minister to the community, within the community, and in overseas missions. Our overseas missions, frontier missions, has multiplied exponentially in the last 20 years. I would assume and hope that momentum would continue into the future.
Just to be a part of all of the growth here and to see what God has done and to know what He's going to do is awesome to me.